I knew buying a house in Pine Hollow Estates meant dealing with an HOA. What I didn't expect was walking out of my garage at 6:30 in the morning and finding the HOA president standing beside my truck, holding my keys, not near my keys, not looking at my keys, holding them, like they belonged to him. The man looked me dead in the eye and said, "These are being temporarily confiscated pending a compliance investigation." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. Then he pulled out his phone, called 911, and told dispatch that I was threatening him. The funny part, he had absolutely no idea who he was talking to, and that mistake ended up costing him a whole lot more than a set of truck keys. My name is Grant Walker. At the time all this happened, I had recently retired after 28 years in law enforcement. Not retired because I wanted to. Retired because I finally realized life was passing me by. For nearly 3 decades my phone had rung at all hours. Middle of dinner, middle of birthdays, middle of Christmas morning, somebody always needed something, some emergency, some crisis, some idiot making bad decisions. Eventually I got tired, not physically tired, soul tired, so I sold my place outside the city and moved to Pine Hollow Estates, a quiet neighborhood tucked against rolling hills and old oak trees. At least that's what the brochure promised: peace, privacy, community, you know. All the words developers love printing on glossy paper. The first week was wonderful. I unpacked boxes, fixed a fence, met a few neighbors, drank coffee on my porch, watched sunsets. For the first time in years, I felt like my shoulders were finally relaxing. Then I met Richard Boone. Now, if you've ever lived under an HOA, you already know exactly who Richard was. Every neighborhood has one. The self-appointed guardian of civilization. The guy who treats bylaws like sacred scripture. The man walked around carrying a clipboard so often that people joked he slept with it. Tall guy, late 50s, perfect polo shirts, perfect haircut, perfect smile, and absolutely impossible to ignore. The first time we spoke, I was trimming some hedges near my driveway. He walked over smiling. "Welcome to Pine Hollow," he said. "Appreciate it." "I'm Richard, HOA president." I shook his hand. The grip was firm, the smile wasn't. "You'll find we take community standards very seriously around here." I remember laughing. "Good thing I like standards." He laughed too, but his eyes never changed. Looking back now, that should have been my first warning. The letters started 3 days later. Grass height violation. My grass was shorter than half the neighborhood. Parking concern. My truck was parked completely inside my driveway. Improper outdoor storage. They were moving boxes. The kind you get from Home Depot. Every few days another letter appeared. Every letter somehow more ridiculous than the last. At first I ignored them. I've dealt with armed suspects, drug traffickers, violent criminals. An HOA president wasn't exactly high on my threat assessment list, but Richard wasn't really interested in violations. That became obvious pretty quickly. He was interested in control. One afternoon I was talking with my next-door neighbor, a retired teacher named Walter. Walter had lived there nearly 15 years. Nice guy, kind of person who still mailed handwritten Christmas cards. We were standing near the mailbox when Richard walked by. The second he disappeared around the corner, Walter leaned closer and lowered his voice. "You know he's targeting you, right?" I laughed. "Targeting me?" Walter nodded. "You don't bend. What does that mean?" "He likes people who apologize." I looked confused. Walter shrugged. "Most folks just nod and do whatever he says." "You ask questions." That stuck with me because he was right. Every interaction with Richard followed the same pattern. He'd make a demand, I'd ask why, and somehow that always irritated him. A week later things escalated. I came home from town and found Richard standing in my driveway taking pictures of my workshop. Not the front, not from the street. He was actually on my property taking pictures. "What are you doing?" I asked. He didn't even look embarrassed. "Documenting potential violations." "From my driveway? It's HOA business." "No," I said, "it's trespassing." His face tightened immediately. For the first time the friendly mask slipped, just a little, enough for me to see what was underneath. That conversation ended with him storming away while muttering something about uncooperative residents. After that, the letters doubled, then tripled. Some were so ridiculous they bordered on comedy. One claimed my porch light created visual inconsistency. Another suggested my truck projected an industrial aesthetic. Industrial aesthetic. I had to read that one twice. At some point I stopped being annoyed and started being fascinated. I wanted to understand what made a grown man obsess over somebody else's porch light. Then I learned something important. Richard hadn't always been like this. A few neighbors quietly filled me in. Years earlier, the HOA board had been disorganized. Nobody volunteered. Nobody wanted responsibility. Richard stepped up. At first, people loved him. Things became organized. Budgets improved. Maintenance improved. The neighborhood looked better. But somewhere along the way, organization became authority. Authority became power. And power became identity. That's the dangerous part. Not when someone gains power, when they start believing they're nothing without it. The more I learned, the more everything made sense. Richard wasn't protecting the neighborhood. He was protecting the role he'd built his entire self-worth around. And then came the morning everything exploded. The morning with the keys. I remember every detail, the temperature, the smell of fresh-cut grass, the sound of birds in the trees. I was loading tools into my truck because I planned to repair some trim around the workshop. Simple Saturday morning, nothing unusual. I placed my keys on the hood for maybe 5 seconds. 5. When I turned back around, Richard was there. Like he'd materialized out of thin air, clipboard in one hand, my truck keys in the other. I stared, he stared back. "Richard," he lifted the keys. "This vehicle is under investigation." I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. Under investigation, pending HOA review. I looked at him, then at my keys, then back at him. "You took my keys. They are being temporarily confiscated." "No," I said. "They're being stolen." His jaw tightened. "I have authority under community guidelines." "You absolutely do not." For a moment neither of us moved, then I held out my hand. "Give them back." Instead of returning them, he stepped backward. That was the exact moment I knew this wasn't about rules anymore. This was personal. "You need to calm down," he said. I wasn't even remotely angry yet. "I'm perfectly calm. You appear aggressive." "I appear confused." He immediately pulled out his phone. And before I could say another word, he dialed 911. I watched him tell dispatch that a homeowner was threatening him, that he feared for his safety, that the situation was escalating. Meanwhile, I was standing 10 feet away holding a tape measure. A tape measure. I remember thinking, this man has completely lost touch with reality. What Richard didn't know was that years in law enforcement teach you certain habits. One of those habits is documentation. The second he grabbed my keys, I started recording. Every word. Every accusation, every lie. The camera captured all of it. By now neighbors were emerging from their homes, porches filled, curtains moved, garage doors opened. Nothing spreads faster than neighborhood drama before breakfast. Richard stood there looking incredibly confident, almost proud, like he had finally won. Like law enforcement was about to arrive and validate everything he'd been telling himself for years. I leaned against my truck and waited. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone keep talking. A few minutes later, I heard sirens in the distance, growing louder, getting closer. Richard straightened his posture, adjusted his collar, smoothed his shirt, preparing for his big moment. Watching him, I couldn't help wondering how this was all going to end. Because one thing was certain. The officers responding to that call were about to walk into a situation Richard Boone never saw coming. And when they did, everything in Pine Hollow Estates was about to change. I've spent most of my adult life around law enforcement, long enough to recognize the sound of approaching patrol cars before most people even notice them, long enough to know exactly how officers evaluate a scene the moment they arrive, and long enough to know that Richard Boone had just made a mistake that was about to age very badly. The sirens grew louder, then quieter. then disappeared completely as 2 patrol units rolled into Pine Hollow Estates and stopped in front of my house. Richard immediately straightened up. You would have thought the president himself had arrived. He smoothed his shirt, lifted his chin, and started walking toward the cruisers before the officers had even stepped out. Meanwhile, I stayed exactly where I was, leaning against my truck, hands visible, calm, watching. The first deputy out of the vehicle was Tyler Reynolds. Good deputy. Smart, steady, not the type to jump to conclusions. The second officer was Kevin Morales, also solid. You learn a lot about people after years of working alongside them, and I trusted both of them. Neither officer had seen me yet. Richard reached them first. Officers, thank God you're here. The performance started immediately. His voice trembled. His breathing suddenly sounded dramatic. The man deserved an Oscar. Sir, Reynolds said calmly, tell us what happened. Richard pointed directly at me. He became aggressive. I almost laughed. He threatened me, not even close. He attempted to interfere with HOA enforcement. Now we were entering science fiction. And he tried taking HOA property. HOA property, my truck keys, my own truck keys. I watched Reynolds' expression carefully. Years of police work had taught him the same thing it taught me. People who tell the truth usually give facts. People who lie usually tell stories. Richard was telling a story. Reynolds nodded politely, then looked toward me. I could already see questions forming behind his eyes. Sir, he called, would you mind coming over here? Not at all. I walked over slowly, no rush, no attitude, no drama, the exact opposite of Richard. As I approached, Richard took a step backward, actually stepped backward, like I was some dangerous criminal. The irony almost hurt. Reynolds addressed me first. Sir, can you explain what's going on? Absolutely. I pointed toward Richard. He walked onto my property. I pointed toward the keys still clutched in his hand. He took those. Then I pointed toward my phone, and I recorded the entire thing. For the first time all morning, Richard's confidence flickered, just a little, like a light bulb losing power. You recorded it, Morales asked. Every second. That answer changed everything. Because evidence doesn't care about opinions. Evidence doesn't care about HOA bylaws. Evidence doesn't care about ego. Evidence simply exists. Reynolds nodded. Before we watch that, can I see some identification? Of course. Now here's the part nobody saw coming. Not Richard, not the neighbors, not even the officers. I reached into my wallet and handed Reynolds my credentials. He glanced down, then froze, actually froze. For a full second nothing happened. Then his eyes snapped back up to mine. Wait. He looked at the badge again, then back at me, then back at the badge. I watched his brain put the pieces together. The moment realization landed was almost visible, like somebody flipped on a light switch. Sheriff Walker, I smiled. Morning, Tyler. His face changed immediately, not fear, not panic, professional shock. The kind you get when you suddenly realize you've walked into a completely different situation than the one dispatch described. Sir, I had no idea you lived here. Just moved in. Morales leaned over, saw the credentials, and nearly had the same reaction. Richard looked back and forth between all three of us, confused, lost, desperately trying to figure out why the conversation had suddenly shifted. Then Reynolds said the words that hit him like a freight train. You called 911 on the county sheriff? Silence. Absolute silence. Even the neighbors stopped whispering. Richard blinked. The sheriff? Nobody spoke. The sheriff, he repeated. I nodded. That's me. His face turned white. Not pale, white. Like somebody had unplugged him from the wall. You never told me, I shrugged. You never asked. The man looked physically dizzy. Suddenly all those violation letters, all those threats, all those little power plays, every one of them was replaying inside his head. And for the first time he understood exactly how bad things looked. But instead of admitting it, he doubled down. People like Richard usually do. No, he said quickly. That doesn't matter. Actually, it didn't. The law applies equally. That's the funny thing. Whether I was the sheriff or a mechanic or a school teacher, stealing my keys would have still been stealing my keys. Richard pointed toward me. He was threatening me. Reynolds looked at my phone. The video should clear that up. The confidence disappeared from Richard's face entirely. Gone, just gone. Morales watched the footage first. Then Reynolds. Neither spoke while watching. They simply listened. Every word, every accusation, every lie. Every ridiculous statement about HOA authority. The longer the video played, the tighter Reynolds' jaw became. When it ended, he slowly lowered the phone, then looked directly at Richard. "Sir." His voice was calm, too calm, the dangerous kind of calm. "This video does not support your statement." Richard swallowed hard. "I felt threatened." "No," Reynolds shook his head. "You reported specific actions." Richard's eyes darted around, searching for an escape route. "There were violations. Violations on emergencies. I was enforcing rules. You took his property. I confiscated it," the deputy sighed. "You don't have legal authority to confiscate anything." That one landed hard. The neighborhood was completely silent now. Every porch, every driveway, every spectator. Nobody wanted to miss a second. Richard looked around and finally realized something. The crowd wasn't on his side. Maybe they never had been. Maybe they were simply afraid to say so. And now that fear was disappearing. Morales handed me back my phone, then turned toward Richard. "Sir, we need the keys returned immediately." Richard looked down at them, almost like he'd forgotten he was still holding them. Slowly, reluctantly, he handed them over. The tiny jingle of metal sounded strangely loud. I took them back. Simple, ordinary, yet somehow it felt symbolic, because it wasn't really about the keys anymore. It was about accountability. For years, Richard had operated under the assumption that nobody would challenge him. Nobody would question him. Nobody would push back. Now reality was standing directly in front of him, and reality wasn't impressed. Reynolds looked toward me. "Sheriff, how would you like to proceed?" Every head in the neighborhood turned. The question hung in the air, because everybody knew exactly what he was asking. Did I want charges? Did I want theft documented? Did I want false reporting investigated? Did I want Richard arrested? I could see the fear in Richard's eyes now. Real fear, not the fake kind he performed on the 911 call. The genuine kind. The kind that arrives when consequences finally show up. And honestly, part of me wanted to do it, not because I hated him, because I didn't, but because people shouldn't be allowed to weaponize authority. Whether that authority comes from a badge or a clipboard, the easy choice would have been punishment. The harder choice was figuring out what would actually fix the problem, because Richard wasn't the disease, he was a symptom. The real problem was bigger, years bigger, an entire HOA structure that had allowed one man to become untouchable. I looked at Reynolds, then at Richard, then at the dozens of neighbors watching from every direction, and that's when I made a decision nobody expected. No arrests. A collective gasp moved through the crowd. Richard nearly collapsed with relief. But I wasn't finished. Yet. His relief vanished immediately. I took a step forward, not aggressively, just enough to make sure everybody could hear. "Richard, this ends today." His shoulders stiffened. "You've spent years confusing leadership with control." Nobody interrupted. "You've used fear where respect would have worked better." A few neighbors nodded. "You've treated homeowners like subjects instead of neighbors." More nods. More agreement, more people finally finding their voice. Then I looked directly at him, and if I was just another resident, this would have ended very differently. He couldn't argue, because he knew it was true, the officers knew it was true, the neighbors knew it was true, everybody knew it. I turned toward the crowd. "This community deserves better." Silence. The good kind, the listening kind. Then I made an announcement that changed everything. "I want a full HOA meeting scheduled this week." Murmurs spread instantly. "A public meeting." More murmurs. "We're going to discuss authority, accountability, and whether this board still represents the people who live here." Richard looked like he'd been punched, because he finally understood. This wasn't about police anymore. This was about something much worse, the people, and for the first time in years, the people were starting to wake up. As the officers finished documenting the incident, neighbors slowly began gathering in small groups, talking, whispering, comparing stories, sharing frustrations. The atmosphere had changed. Something had cracked open, and once that happens, you can't force it closed again. Richard stood frozen in the middle of the driveway, watching everything unfold, watching control slip through his fingers, watching years of carefully built authority start collapsing around him. And standing there looking at his face, I realized the biggest battle wasn't going to happen in my driveway. It was going to happen at that HOA meeting. Because once the truth gets out, people start asking questions. And when people start asking questions, power gets very nervous. What happened at that meeting a few nights later shocked the entire neighborhood. And by the time it was over, Richard Boone would lose something he thought nobody could ever take away. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday night. 3 days. That's all it took for Pine Hollow Estates to transform from a quiet neighborhood into the center of what felt like a small-town political uprising. By Tuesday morning, people were already talking. By Wednesday afternoon, people were choosing sides. By Thursday evening, the clubhouse parking lot was overflowing. Cars lined both sides of the street. Neighbors who never attended meetings suddenly showed up early. Some brought notebooks. Some brought folders. A few looked like they were preparing for trial. Honestly, maybe they were. I pulled into the parking lot about 20 minutes before the meeting started and immediately knew this wasn't going to be a normal HOA gathering. Usually these meetings attracted maybe 15 people, 20 on a busy night. That night there were well over 100. People filled the clubhouse, the hallway, the patio, even the lawn outside. I spotted Walter near the entrance. He shook his head and laughed. Never seen anything like this. Neither have I. You know, half these people haven't attended a meeting in 10 years. I believe it, Walter smiled. They're not here for the HOA. No, they're here for Richard. I couldn't argue with that. Inside, the atmosphere felt electric. Not angry, not exactly. More like a community that had spent years swallowing frustration and finally saw an opportunity to speak. The board members sat at the front table. Most looked uncomfortable. A couple looked terrified. One kept adjusting his tie every 30 seconds. Then Richard walked in. The room immediately fell quiet. It was subtle but noticeable, like someone had turned down the volume. For the first time since I'd met him, Richard didn't look confident. No clipboard, no polished smile, no commanding presence, just a tired man carrying a folder. He sat down without speaking. And for a moment I almost felt bad for him. Almost. The meeting began. Board members stumbled through opening remarks, procedural announcements, approval of previous minutes. Nobody cared. Everyone knew why they were there. Finally, the acting secretary cleared her throat. The board will now address concerns regarding recent events involving HOA President Richard Boone. That was it. The moment everybody had been waiting for. The room grew completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Then all eyes turned toward me. I stood. Not because I enjoyed attention. Actually, I hated it. But if we were going to do this, we were going to do it honestly. I walked to the front, looked around the room, and told the story exactly as it happened. No exaggeration, no dramatic speeches, no personal attacks, just facts. I described the violation letters, the escalating behavior, the photographs taken on my property, the truck keys, the 911 call, the recording, the deputies, everything. People listened carefully. The longer I spoke, the quieter the room became. Because while many residents knew pieces of the story, very few knew all of it. When I finished, nobody applauded, nobody cheered. They simply sat there absorbing it. Then came the part I wasn't expecting. The secretary looked toward Richard. Would you like to respond? For a moment I thought he'd fight. Argue, deflect, blame. That's usually how these situations go. Instead, Richard slowly stood up. And what happened next surprised everyone, including me. He looked older somehow. Not physically, emotionally, like years had suddenly caught up with him. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. What Grant said is true. The room froze. You could literally feel the surprise. A few people exchanged confused looks. Others leaned forward. Richard took a deep breath, then continued. I took the keys. Nobody moved. I made the call, still silence. I shouldn't have. There it was, the admission, simple, direct, painfully honest. Richard looked around the room. At neighbors, friends, people he'd known for years, and for the first time he wasn't speaking as HOA president, he was speaking as a man. I told myself I was protecting the neighborhood. His voice cracked slightly, but somewhere along the way I stopped protecting it. The room remained silent. I started controlling it. A woman near the back wiped her eyes, not because she liked Richard, because everyone could hear the truth in his voice. He wasn't performing, he wasn't campaigning. He wasn't defending himself. He was finally being honest, and honesty has a strange way of changing a room, even when it's late, even when it's painful. Richard swallowed hard. I became so focused on rules that I forgot the people those rules were supposed to serve. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Nobody attacked him because everybody understood something important in that moment. This wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about years. Years of power. Years of fear. Years of believing authority made him valuable. And now he was facing the consequences. The floor opened for discussion. That was when things got interesting. Hands shot up everywhere. Residents shared stories. Violation notices, arguments, warnings, conflicts. Some were minor, some were serious, many I'd never heard before, and a pattern quickly emerged. The problem wasn't just Richard. The problem was the system. Too much authority concentrated in one position. Too little accountability. Too much secrecy. Too much fear. As story after story filled the room, I could see something changing. People weren't just complaining anymore. They were problem-solving, offering ideas, suggesting reforms, building solutions. For the first time all evening, the conversation stopped being about punishment and started becoming about improvement. Eventually, someone stood up and asked the question everyone knew was coming. Should Richard remain president? The room instantly grew tense. Because now there would be a decision. A real one. The board discussed procedures, bylaws, voting requirements. Eventually they settled on a confidential vote. Simple majority, fair, transparent, everybody agreed. Ballots were distributed, pens clicked, papers rustled, people marked their choices. Then the counting began. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. The entire clubhouse felt frozen. The first vote was read, remove. The second, remove. The third, retain, murmurs. The fourth, remove. The fifth, remove, and it kept going, one after another. By the time counting finished, the outcome wasn't close, not remotely close. Richard Boone had been removed as HOA president just like that. Years of authority ended with a stack of paper ballots. The room sat quietly. There was no celebration, no cheering, no victory dance. Because despite everything, people understood this wasn't entertainment. This was someone's life. Someone's identity, someone's mistake finally catching up with him. Richard stood again. I expected disappointment, maybe anger. Instead, he nodded slowly. I accept the decision. The room remained silent. I earned it. That hit harder than any argument could have, because deep down everyone knew he was right. Then he said something I'll never forget. The truth is, he paused, looking around the room one final time. I stopped being your neighbor a long time ago. Nobody moved. I became your supervisor. A few heads nodded. And that's not what a community is supposed to be. For the first time all evening, I saw genuine emotion on people's faces. Not anger, not resentment, understanding. Richard continued. I can't change what's already happened. He looked toward me. But I can apologize. I nodded. He nodded back, and somehow that was enough. Not forgiveness, not complete redemption, just acknowledgement, the beginning of accountability. After that, attention shifted toward reform. New oversight procedures. Limits on enforcement authority. Mandatory board review of violations. Conflict resolution committees, transparency requirements, resident feedback sessions. The ideas flowed for nearly 2 hours, and for the first time in years, people were excited about their HOA. Imagine that, excited about an HOA. Nobody would have believed it. Eventually, the meeting ended. People gathered in small groups, talking, laughing, planning. There was a sense of optimism. I'd never felt in Pine Hollow Estates before. Like a weight had been lifted. As residents slowly filtered outside, I stayed behind, mostly because I was tired, partly because I wanted a quiet moment. That's when Richard approached me, just the two of us. No audience, no crowd, no politics. Grant. Richard. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me again. You could have had me arrested. I could have. Why didn't you? I thought about that question, honestly, carefully. Then I answered. Because I wasn't trying to beat you. He frowned slightly. I was trying to fix the problem. Something shifted in his expression. Understanding maybe. Relief, possibly both. He nodded slowly. I don't know who I am without that position. There it was, the real issue, not power, identity. The thing underneath the power. The thing that had been driving all of this from the beginning. I looked at him for a moment, then smiled. Maybe that's your chance to find out. For the first time all night, Richard laughed. A genuine laugh, small, tired, human. Maybe you're right. We shook hands, not as enemies, not as friends, just two men who had finally reached the truth. Then he walked away. The months that followed brought a lot of changes. The HOA became more transparent. Residents became more involved. Board members became more accountable. And surprisingly, Richard stayed. Most people assumed he'd move, disappear, hide. He didn't. Instead, he joined volunteer committees, helped organize community projects, and slowly rebuilt trust, not through authority, through service, the harder way, the better way. Every now and then I'd see him walking through the neighborhood, no clipboard, no violation notices, no power trips, just another resident, and honestly, he seemed happier. Maybe losing control was the best thing that ever happened to him. Maybe it was the best thing that happened to all of us. Because here's what I learned from that entire experience. Power isn't dangerous because it exists. Power becomes dangerous when it stops answering to anyone, whether it's a politician, a boss, a sheriff, or an HOA president. The moment accountability disappears, problems begin, but communities are stronger than any one person. And when good people finally decide to speak up, ask questions, and get involved, change happens. Real change. So now I want to hear from you. Was Richard treated fairly? Would you have pressed charges if you were in my position? Or do you think giving him a chance to change was the right call? Let me know down in the comments, because I have a feeling people are going to disagree on this one. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, a power-hungry neighbor, or somebody who forgot that authority comes with responsibility, share your story below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around, because trust me, this wasn't the last unbelievable HOA story I've lived through.